Well, a great good evening to you all, and thank you for coming to this next in the President's Lecture Series. My name is Dave Emmons. I'm a professor of history emeritus at the University of Montana. I looked up emeritus just today and learned that it means was once but isn't anymore. Which is a very apt description. I didn't know the Latins were, that conversant with the career path of an American academic. I also learned today that the President's Lecture Series is now in its 30th year, and I found that both astonishing and alarming. Another unneeded indication of why I'm emeritus. The President's Lecture Series, and I want to spend a little bit of time just, briefly outlining it. It began at the suggestion 30 years ago of then President Jim Cook, who had the very good sense to ask my friend and colleague Richard Drake if he would tend to the needs of this fledgling lecture series. Everyone connected in any way with the University of Montana has benefited from Cook's inspired idea and Richard's masterful handling of it. Tonight, we benefit again. I would also like to offer my thanks, and those of the rest of you, I'm sure, sincere thanks to President Royce Engstrom for continuing this most important of academic enterprises. It speaks, first of all, to President Engstrom's strong and unwavering belief that the humanities, very generally defined, I grant, but that the humanities are absolutely central to this university's mission, and that budgets, even the roughest of them, have to make room for those humanities. Thank you and thank him. I also would remind you all that the 300 plus superb lectures in this series, and that's how many there have come to you without cost. This is the cheapest ticket in town. But you all knew that. What you might not know is that you can contribute to this series, that outside in the lobby are payment cards with the information you need about how to make a donation to the President's Lecture Series. In addition to President Engstrom and Richard Drake, I want also to acknowledge himself, as he is known, the indefatigable Treilach Oiredoin, the Ard Rí, the High King of Irish Studies at UM. I had occasion once to say that Treilach had built UM's Irish Studies program through sheer force of personality and a willingness to work 20-hour days. The personality is still intact and still forceful, but I've come to believe that he doesn't sleep at all. The Irish program is the silent sponsor of this evening's talk. Treilach Oiredoin made it happen. I also want to mention, in sincere gratitude, the silent sponsor of the silent sponsor, Dean Chris Comer, who in the face of problems known only to deans, shepherded the Irish Studies program through some dark days and gave it renewed hope. And he was aided in that last by a most generous gift from my good pal, Summerfield Baldridge, and his wife, Julie, who made a flourishing Irish Studies program a part of their legacy to the University of Montana. There are a lot of people who deserve a lot of thanks, and I'm sure I left a lot out, but these are the special ones. Our speaker tonight is Professor Ruan O'Donnell from the University of Limerick in the lovely Irish county of that name. This lecture, I should say, is being double billed. It is also the keynote address of the Conference of the Western Region of the American Conference of Irish Studies, a national professional organization, the best of its kind in this field. And the Western region is holding its annual meeting this year in Missoula. And I must also add, that's also Trayloc's doing. I recently had the pleasure of watching Ruan's talking head on the RTE documentary on the Irish Rising of 1916. I commend it to you, by the way. PBS has shown it on some of its channels, and I hope with enough agitation they'll show it here in Missoula. Liam Neeson co-starred with Ruan O'Donnell, but Ruan had the better lines, and I think the better delivery. He and the others also made in that documentary, as he has in his writing, the clear point that 2016 in Ireland is not a year of centennial celebration. The Rising of 1916 is not an event that one celebrates. I admit that I was a bit surprised to see it referred to as a tragedy in the President's lecture series announcement, but not surprised at all to see that it was being commemorated, not celebrated. That said, Ruan also makes clear that we must not forget what happened in Dublin on April 24th, 1916. Men and women from one of the smallest and, by British accounting, least consequential of Britain's imperial colonies proclaimed that Ireland was no longer a colony and no longer in that empire. That from this point forward, it would be an independent Irish republic. I do not exaggerate, at least knowingly. I've been known to exaggerate, I guess, but never on purpose. But I don't think I am exaggerating when I say that nothing anywhere in the world would ever be the same again. Right now, this country and others, and all others, live with the consequences of what happens when you let imperial cartographers, particularly, it seems to me, British imperial cartographers, sharpen their pencils, draw lines on maps, and create nations willy-nilly. Lines and nations that serve British imperial needs but no one else's. For calling all of those cartographers and other imperial pretenders to account, I join Ruan and all anti-imperialists everywhere in commemorating Easter in Ireland, 1916. Writing history in Ireland is a blood sport, too often a quite impolite one. Ruan's work is a notable exception. No one has dealt with 1916, in my mind, more intelligently, more fairly, more insightfully than Ruan O'Donnell. He has researched and written books on Robert Emmet, the Great Famine, the Easter Rising, and most recently, Irish Republicans in British prisons during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, 1968 to 1998. All of his works reveal the balance and good judgment he brings to the historian's craft. Tonight he favors us with a presentation on Irish America's contribution to that 100-year-old Irish rebuke of Britain's and all other empires. And it is then with great pleasure that I welcome Ruan O'Donnell.
Well, that's a very kind and thoughtful and perceptive welcome there. I only just met Dave, but I read his book on the Irish Imbute. And I told him to his face, it's my pleasure to be able to do someone who can sometimes move around the world, can meet academics and people involved in diplomacy, that I regard him as one of the finest historians of Irish America. And I mean that. That is a classic book which should remain forever in print. I wish it was cheaper, but it's worth every cent. If you don't own a copy, go and look at it in the library. It is meticulous research and telling an important story about a very significant part of our diaspora, a living and breathing one, not fossilized, not stuck in time, not degraded, not decrepit, but active and vibrant, and your presence here tonight fills me with gratitude and pleasure. This is an extraordinary state. I've only been here 3 days. I was saying yesterday, I don't think I'm going home. I have to send for my other half, and I'm sure she'll come if I explain to her the kindness and generosity with which I've been treated. This lecture won't take more than 3 hours for a thumbnail sketch. I could literally talk for ages. I'd love to give an entire module on the international aspects of 1916, and you could do a whole one on the American dimension to 1916. I knew there was something there, and I knew there was more there than other people had delved at when I sort of put a small pamphlet together. I now realize there's even more, And when you come down to certain levels of detail, which is possible in places like Montana due to the fine work of the university here, of the Irish Studies program here, of the well-appointed archives in Butte themselves, you realize, you know what, we can get something working here. And if there was a national level project or international level project, we could write a very comprehensive history. It's too much for any one person. In fact, it would require a management team and quite a few, I suppose, enthusiastic postgrad students. I was once that soldier, but others will need to take up the pen and go forward. So what I want to do tonight is assume that some of you know very little about the Rising itself, and I'm going to concentrate on the American dimension to it. Let's put it this way. There would have been an insurrection, a unilateral insurrection in Ireland at some point in the 1910s, almost certainly prior to the anticipated end of the Great War, the 1418 War. The fact that it happened in 1916 bore a lot to the specific intervention of Irish Americans and their supporters in New York, in Philadelphia, Chicago to some degree, and elsewhere. And again, we only see the traces that have emerged from the archives that are extant, from the memoirs that have been published, out of a secret organization. And bear in mind, none of those at the helm of that organization ever left substantial memoirs, at least not that we've seen, and that there's no significant internal documentation. This is quite a hard task. But you can see the manifestation of their work in Dublin on the 24th of April 1916, when Ireland took its place amongst the nations of the world, when we declared the Irish Republic, a democratic republic. More of that later. The bedrock of potential, I suppose, was the Irish diaspora. It was colossal. We are probably the most outwardly migrated substantial population. The Maltese may be per capita pro rata more than us outside, but there's millions of us. And most of us are in the United States and in Canada, with very large bodies in the United Kingdom, proportionally very high in Australasia, and with exotic pockets of places like South Africa and Argentina, right? And there's others, but these are the big ones. Probably, actually, there's more Irish people buried in 2 cemeteries in Chicago than are alive now in Ireland. That's certainly the case of the major graveyards in Queens, New York, and this is written time and time over in this country. The numbers are staggering. Ourselves and the Germans are almost certainly, in actuality, as opposed to self-definition, the biggest single ethnic components in this colossal country. And we're at least as spread as they are, and due to our focus on urbanization in a way that many Northern Europeans and Germans in particular did not do, they were also on the land, we are disproportionately effective in many of the great cities of the East Coast, the Midwest, and the Far West, with a very old Irish population in the South. But here's the thing. An Irishman, Rotterdam, accompanied the French expedition that founded Albany, New York. The Irish were here with the French Empire. The Irish were here with the Spanish Empire, and we were here with the Mexican Army, right? We have a very variegated ancient history to this country. We were here from the start. Now, we weren't on the Mayflower, but God almighty, thank God for that. We were probably in Newfoundland before them, but who's counting, who's boasting? Let's put it this way. There's lots of us here. And if you come forward to the replenishment of that, with the hemorrhaging of the 1840s, 1850s, due to An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, the so-called Irish famine, when there was no famine, there was a shortage of affordable food, but there's plenty of food for everybody. Get me back another time, if you will, and I'll explain what I mean. But for now, when you believe that 1.2 million of your people have been killed, and that you've been driven across the ocean in squalor, with 50,000 plus dying in the crossings of 1847 and just after, if you find yourself coming to cities where your own people are already established and are not necessarily capable of looking after you, when you double the population of New York and triple the population of Boston, and when you flood into Philadelphia to the point you have hundreds of thousands of Irish-born people there in 1900, into Baltimore, into Chicago in the biggest numbers of all, some of whom came across the Canadian border later on, when you have the people who end up in San Francisco by various means, including crossing from Australia, a very exotic route indeed, you're looking at a very substantial element of people who are reinforced by the common experience of migration under trauma, living in areas that were sometimes 100% Irish. In the 1950s, parts of South Bronx, parts of South Chicago were 100% Irish. And I know that's the case in certain subsets of society in Montana. It's remarkable, but it's not good. It's good for the people who survive and get integrated and go forward, because they definitely have a better life than they would have at home. There's no doubt about that. They were growing up under trying circumstances at the best of times. But an element within that, coalesced from coast to coast, was revolutionary. The British anticipated this, and it had always been thus. Every significant Irish revolutionary upheaval led to a diaspora here of a very attenuated nature, a very focused Republican radical nature since the 1790s. Again, after 1803, Thomas Addis Emmet, the great sort of father of New York law, case in point, Attorney General of New York State during the War of 1812, many of the officers in the American Army fought the British again, had fought them in 1798 as Irish rebels, and in 1803. I mean, there's tremendous stories there. The leadership of 1848, someone who escaped here, not least Thomas Francis Maher, Maher of the Sword, and he wasn't called that because he was a nice guy or a pensman. He knew which one was mightier. I mean, his experience. He traversed the globe as a prisoner of the British, escaped here, and had an illustrious and then a controversial career. Those survivors of the 1848 leadership from 1858 co-founded the modern Irish Republican movement, using the politics of the early Republicans of the 1790s, the contemporaries of Washington, the contemporaries of Franklin, the contemporaries of Jefferson, all of whom were in contact with their Irish contemporaries and supported them, particularly Jefferson. They decided that there was no constitutional path to common decency in Ireland. There's no question of democracy. Ireland and Britain were only proto-democracies in the 19th century. There was something called a parliament, but really the word is misused. These days we wouldn't call it that. It was a place where a very small element, elected by some men, had limited powers and no women, and could be vetoed by aristocrats and churchmen of the right churches and not the other churches. That's not a parliament. It's a process, it's a forum, it's not a parliament. From 1858, you have this great, seismic, underestimated, and still quite mysterious conjunction. You have the co-foundation of the movement in Dublin and New York. It went through various incarnations of various names, but from 1858, the common line of coherence is there. And don't get confused by some of the schisms and the personalities and the name changes. Basically speaking, I'm talking about the Fenian Brotherhood in New York and the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Dublin. Now, very quickly, the Fenians here got reorganized as Clan na Gael, but the Clan are Fenians, and the IRB are Fenians. And when the when the Clan invaded Canada in 1866, they used the name of the IRB at war, which is the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. It's on their uniforms, it's on their flags, it's on their buttons. And I'll come to that later on. It's very important to understand that in terms of the hidden hand of Fenianism, sort of deep-seated ideological, militant, extremist, revolutionary, violent Fenianism, and that's what it is. I mean, they weren't going to Sunday school, right? These were people who believed in quite radical ideas, such as the separation of church and state, right? They could be devout Catholics and devout Protestants, but they believed the separation of church and state because their political agenda was in the line of the French revolutionary traditions and the American revolutionary traditions. And that's why they wanted to posit Ireland in an appropriate Hibernian context. So, moving on. Between 1897 and 1907, just take those 10 years, many things happened that collectively, in retrospect, and that's the great friend of the historian, retrospection, appear to have been very important. Now, at the time, it was clear that the ground was moving, that there was a quickening of political pace and cultural activity, that things were never going to be the same again, but no one was too sure exactly where it was going to go. But within this sort of febrile environment, there were people with very specific ideas about where they wanted it to go. And amongst them were the Fenians. Now, let's bear with me for a second. 1897 forward, you have the British Famine Queen's Jubilee, which was a spectacular failure in Ireland, but had led to enough of a demonstration in Dublin to get the backs up of those who said, that's the Famine Queen. You know, this is the generation of those who survived in living memory of the remnant of the Irish population, which had been at least 8.5 million in 1845, and the early 1900s dipped below 4 million, right? So that's a lot of people missing. Maybe 1.2 million dead, the rest people of childbearing age, predominantly in the diaspora, and more of that in a second. John Devoy's brother. John Devoy didn't join the French Foreign Legion to get military training for nothing. John Devoy wasn't a lifelong Fenian and doyen of this tradition for nothing. And I could give you many other examples. But in 1897, you see things happening. The coincidence of the anniversary of 1798, 100 years later, Wolfe Tone and all of that, very important for those people. So they acted in many different fronts to try and influence the ordinary innocent person, to talent spot, to recruit, to cultivate and to radicalize the message of Tone at a time it was dangerous to do so. There's no national government in Ireland. Everything was run from London. The Irish Parliamentary Party had been shattered by the tragedy of the Parnellite split a party that had great possibilities for getting a better deal for Ireland within the United Kingdom, and even possibly ultimately outside of it, but in good partnership with our nearest neighbour and another, I suppose, member of our dynastic family. The IPP was reviving, and ultimately John Redmond began to control the factionalised party with some effect, which by 1911 secured the abolition of the aristocratic House of Lords veto on the legislation coming from the House of Commons. That's important, because even if you got the Home Rule Bill, in other words, self-rule for Ireland, through the lower house, the Lords were going to veto it because they didn't care. In fact, if anything, they were hostile, sectarian, condescending. They were not the friends of you or me. Now, from 1911, this is the highest achievement of the IPP. They got the veto, and the following year, they got the third Home Rule Bill, which in 2 years would become law and probably devolve some form of regionalised governance, not a true nation state, far from it, but some form of governance that would make something like An Gorta Mór impossible to recur, because no Irish forum could stand over that if they had the options to address it. And unfortunately, Westminster did not. On this side of the Atlantic, things were happening that are complicated to explain, and bear with me. I'll just tell you what they were, and I'll tell you later on why they're important. A major schism within the Ancient Order of Hibernians was healed. A major schism within the Clan na Gael organisation was healed. And you get authoritative leaderships in both camps. But let me read my first ad hoc extract once I wet my throat here. I'm labouring under a nasty cold that makes it hard for me to project. But it makes me speak a bit slower, so count yourselves lucky. This is me slow. I'm trying to be slow here, guys. I'm going to give you a little vignette about the nature of this Irish diaspora and what it looked like, or could look like. This is by a man some of you may have heard of, but I'd be surprised. A guy called Tom Byrne. He was born at Carrickmacross in Monaghan. As a young boy, he moved to Dublin. From there, with no prospects in a city where people were dying at third world rates from disease and living in chronic tenements with some of the lowest maternal survival rates in the world and highest infant mortality rates in the world, thanks to British malgovernment in Ireland, he went, as many of his generation did, to work in the mines in Johannesburg. What happened there? The British from the Cape Colony decided they would invade the Transvaal and Orange Free State, and they fought a very bloody and partially successful, ultimately politically so, war against the Boer republics. Now, at this point, Byrne had integrated himself in the Irish National Foresters. Now, they were all over America too. Probably after AOH, they might have been the biggest. You find them in Australia, you find them in the UK, you find them here. That was basically a fraternal form of insurance society and social society. He decided, I don't like khaki soldiers coming to shoot me and my Boer friends. And he was one of the Irishmen who rallied to the pro-Boer commandos. One of them was largely Irish-American, and one of them was largely Irish recruited. You'll be aware that many men from Butte went and fought, and some of them buried back here in Butte. Up in Queen of Peace Cemetery in Chicago, you have a very fine Clan na Gael memorial of a guy dressed in their uniform. And many of those veterans are buried there. He did this. Then things didn't work out. And I wonder, just give you a sense of this. He's moved internally. He's migrated to South Africa. The Brits keep coming after him, and here's what he does. He fights against them. We'll leave that for now. But the war was lost, and many of them had to bug out or face the consequences, as often happens. They were given a choice. We elected to sail for Europe and America. Okay? We sailed on an Austrian Lloyd vessel to Styria from Delgoa Bay to Trieste, which was then in Austria. We spent a week in Trieste and travelled overland to Hamburg, Germany. We sailed for America from there on the ship called the First Bismarck. Our passage had been paid for by the Boer government agents Ilarenko Marques, and we'd been given money and clothes. On arrival in New York, we were received by the Irish Societies, and John Devoy came on board, the arch-Fenian in New York. I suppose about 50 or 60 of us, including an odd few Irish Americans. We were received by the Clan na Gael, and we were given the option of going to any of the mining camps. They would send us on word to the Irish societies in these places to receive us. The majority of us went to the mining camps in the West. We worked on Montana, Nevada, Colorado, California, and other places for 11 or 12 years. Most of them died there. While in America, I was a member of the Clan na Gael. Whatever mining camp I was in, there was always a branch of the Clan na Gael there. Another Irish society was the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Now think of that. The man has travelled the bloody globe. But he's a Fenian from his birth. He's almost a congenital Fenian. He's an angry young man who's seen some service by the time he's a young man. This is a guy who's adept at explosives, because that's what mining people do, isn't that, from time to time? Yeah, he returned to Ireland and he became the OC of the IRA in County Kildare and took part in 1916 with my wife's great-grandfather, Donnell, who led the Maynooth contingent. Now, that is a type of expansive reality that these people had who were born in the 1800s. It's quite remarkable when you think about it. Now, to continue with my sort of basic train of thought, the revival of these Republican networks was greatly exacerbated by the Boer War, which by 1902 had been diplomatically resolved by the Peace of Rinnigan, Treaty of Rinnigan. The IRB and Fenians were annoyed that they hadn't used the opportunity of Britain being engaged on a foreign front in difficulty to strike harder in their own country, at least to have a goal, to make a gesture, to register a protest. So they resolved that the next time England was in difficulty, they would chance Ireland's opportunity. And this is a particularly cogent theory within the Irish-American networks of Devoy in New York, McGarity in Philadelphia, and Keating in Chicago. Now, another quick extract. Bodenstown, Sowens, County Kildare, is where Wolfe Tone is buried. At least that's what people believe, and I'm not going to say he's not. Every year, less so in recent years, it's a significant place of Republican homage, and many Irish political parties of different stripes, from completely moderate to the more radical elements, go there every year to sort of pay tribute. A quick thing here. This is when, in 1903, the centennial of Robert Emmet's uprising in 1803, the guest of honour is John T. Keating, former national president of AOH, and secretly a very senior member of Clan na Gael. Now, we know he's one of the triangle. He's one of the top three leadership in Philadelphia with Devoy and McGarity, okay? Mr. Keating has long been connected with the cause of Irish nationality, and no man has worked more devotedly in the cause of Kathleen na Houlihan, Ireland. He comes charged with a message of hope and courage from our brethren in America, and we speak for him such a reception at the hands of his countrymen as will show the world that whilst the parliamentarians are pandering to the English king and his garrison in Ireland, and striving to sink still further the idealism of our people, that the heart of nationalist Ireland is still warm, still throbbing in the desire for freedom, and with the determination to attain it, and to honour those who with them desire it and work for it. Now, that's not quite O'Donovan Rossa, panegyric by Pearse, which more later on, but it's a sign that, things are moving, and they were. That's why he was there. And that became the first most significant Bodenstown ever. Prior to that, it wasn't such a big deal. It became a bigger deal due to this sort of invocation from across the Atlantic. Well, let's put it this way. There are other cultural organisations doing tremendous work. The Gaelic Athletic Association, that's an extraordinary amateur sporting body, which I was delighted to hear is thriving in this environment. The Gaelic League, which is trying to basically revive trying to save the Irish language from extinction, basically, and encourage as many you possibly could to adopt it, at least as a second language. They had a presence all over this country also. And what you're going to find is this. There was a massive over-connected membership of what we might call joiners. And I don't mean carpenters, like my grandfather was. You're going to have Hibernian, who's might be a Hibernian official, but secretly in the clan. You're going to have a guy in the clan who's also in the GAA or the Gaelic League, and these combinations were very there. They're very, very much to the fore here. No one's ever in just one thing. And it sort of was quite useful because it led to a very, very tight and meshwork of those who are connected by personality, by common interests, and indeed across almost every state in this enormous nation. By 1907, some of the most important young Fenians of that generation had returned from sojourns in America. Dr. Pat McCartan from Tyrone, Philadelphia still is a major Tyrone centre, back to Tyrone. Back to Dublin, actually, ultimately, but he still lived in Tyrone, where he became involved in the revival of the IRB at the behest of the clan leadership in America. Dermot Lynch, who most of you will not have heard of, a very considerable, clever man, naturalized American citizen, fellow Celtic Society, American Irish Historical Society in New York, a top-level Fenian, the most important Fenian not to be shot by the British in 1916. If they'd known how important he was, I'm sure they would have made a special play for him. And you could understand why they would. Dennis McCulloch, who was fated to become the shadow president of the IRB when the real power behind the throne, no, not a throne, Republicans don't have thrones, they dethrone people on thrones, Tom Clark, right? Clark was sent back in November 1907 from Manorville, Suffolk County in Long Island, New York. He immediately became the treasurer of the Supreme Council of the IRB. Now, this is super secret, of course. No one knew that, unless a very small coterie. And he was Devoy's man in Ireland. And under those people, the IRB got its act together The old guard were politely heaved, asked to go home and not come back, or at least certainly to surrender their officerships and retire with grace, and replaced by younger men like them, some of whom had already experienced long imprisonment for their illegal activities in their youth. That was the case with Clark. There's a lecture in Clark alone, by the way, but I'll spare you. These are important people. By 1916, more than $100,000 of illegal secret Klan money passed through Clark's hands. This was money used to finance people like Sean McDermott, whose sister lived in New York and whose brother later lived in New York. McDermott was the rising star. He was going to be the new Clark in due course. These are the people who talent spotted Patrick Pearse, one of the most extraordinary leaders Irish ever produced. Controversial for reasons that have nothing to do with history, that are more to do with the politics of our very difficult time in Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s. And now, not rehabilitated, it doesn't work like that, but now being given a fair shake by, I'd like to say, people like myself. I gave it a go. Not everyone's thanking me for it, but there you go. This is a revival. 1911, I mentioned that, the veto, gone. 1912, the Home Rule Bill. Very hostile reception in Parliament, but it gets through. House of Lords wanted to delay it for 2 years. The British Conservative Party weren't accepting their own so-called parliamentary processes and helped sponsor the creation of a massive paramilitary army in the north of Ireland, predominantly the Ulster Volunteer Force. The raison d'etre of the Ulster Volunteer Force, who claimed to be loyalists, was to prevent the promulgation of the Home Rule Bill, the enactment of Home Rule in Ireland, which would have done nothing of any harm to them at all, given that it's a very weak piece of legislation that would not have given control of the military, of tax raising, of foreign policy, all the things that would define an actual nation state. However, they didn't care because of the sectarian supremacist element that was quite happy to keep things the way they were. And unfortunately, being bankrolled by powerful figures in the Conservative Party in particular, and in the military, where there was a strong Ulster officer presence, that laid this stage for a crisis. The foundation of the UVF was a godsend for the Fenians, because now they had an issue that ordinary Irish people and the diaspora could get their heads around. They're trying to say, listen, we're not going to get the Republic right now, but we're going to get something, and these clowns are threatening civil war if the British Parliament does what they said they're going to do and voted to do. Here's what we'll do. We'll create a counterweight organisation, and we're going to call them the Irish Volunteers. Now, I could say a lot about the real internal history of the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers were founded in America years before they were founded in Ireland. But most people think they were founded in Dublin on the 25th of November 1913, at the height of a labour dispute, the Titanic lockout dispute. That's true, but here's the thing. They were founded by the IRB, and they were bankrolled by the Clan na Gael. And that's what it was. Now, their name, the first incarnation of their name, was not Irish Volunteers. It was Ógla na hÉireann, in brackets Irish Volunteers. Ógla na hÉireann is translated as Irish Republican Army, and those who knew their Canadian history would have realized this is an IRB incarnation. It was. They wanted a moderate but militant, and not necessarily violent organization, but an armed organization that was big, that they could control. And of that, they would use a portion to unilaterally rise when Ireland's opportunity arose. In other words, British military committed to the Western Front or something like that. They didn't have to wait very long. Now, in the meantime, some quite complicated things happen. And the first thing that you notice, and I notice more than most, is you see a flurry of the most important of this real authoritative commanders across the Atlantic. Let's put it this way. In January 1914, this is just after the foundation of the Volunteers publicly, Thomas Ashe, who you'll be hearing more about in years ahead, and Dermot Lynch return ostensibly to look into Gaelic League, Irish language activities in the United States, and indeed they did that, but really to confer with the Clan na Gael upper secret leadership, to brief them. In February, Patrick Pearse comes on a much more public tour to raise money for two things. His visionary bilingual Irish school, but predominantly Irish language schools, Scoilena, St. Enda's in Dublin, Rathfarnham, County Dublin, now part of the Conurbation Dublin City. But thankfully, the estate itself has been preserved almost intact, and you must go and see it sometime if you haven't already. And also to promote the issues of a fund for the equipment fund for the Irish Volunteers. Now, I've mentioned this before, they weren't talking about tents and compasses. He was telling the Americans who would listen, look, we've got this thing going. It could be huge. We hope to get 200,000 to 300,000 men here, but we haven't got any weapons. The other shire up the north do, because the British government were complicit in allowing them bring in weapons in large Quantrice before the huge consignments in the spring of 1914. But even before the spring of 1914, the Clan knew they had to give some teeth to that organisation. Simply so it would be a counterweight. In other words, we're not going to walk down here and you punch us in the face. We want to make sure when we're going to punch you back, you're going to fall down. So don't punch me first. Right? It's not necessarily they want to start any trouble, but they want to ensure that the Irish nationalist position is respected, the mission of the IPP. Now, the IPP, and people forget this, got right behind the volunteers, and so did the Hibernians. The Hibernians and the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Constitutionalists, the Social Conservative element of Irish society were fully behind the Irish volunteers. Now, there were some, of course, who were not, but if you get 300,000 men, you're doing something right. So when Pearse is saying this, he was also being hosted by Devoy. He worked out of Devoy's office in William Street in Lower Manhattan. He wrote letters on Gaelic American stationery. That was the big organ, the main organ of the Clan Gael organisation. There were others, but that was the main one on the East Coast. He got to meet Judge Donnell, a very important Irish American, of whom more anon, but not this trip. That's a plug for next trip, by the way. I don't even know how subtle I got that in there. Cohallen's interesting, but he's complicated because he's one of the guys who falls out with De Valera later on, and that never ends well if you fall out with De Valera. Suffice to say that he met everyone who mattered. He also met with people like John Quinn, lawyers, patrons of the arts, people involved in Irish cultural activity, and they liked him. He was a brilliant orator. He was received in Brooklyn at the Academy of Music in the worst snowstorm since the 1880s, in the presence of the governor of New York State, an Irish American, of many Supreme Court justices, of leaders of Irish America on the East Coast who thought he was brilliant. He spoke at the Aeolian Hall, which was right down beside Bryant Park at the back of the New York Public Library, again to acclaim. He extended his tour, and most of his speeches are printed verbatim in the page of the Gaelic American. So the best place to find Pearse's speeches is not in Ireland, it's in the Gaelic American published out of New York, because they'd have vested interest. Look at this guy saying. Now, he's our guy, and he was, because Pearse was a Fenian. He'd been brought in. And he'd been brought in at a high level, having moved in the milieu of the authoritative commanders, like Clark, like McDermott. And he became effectively, I've described him as this, the public relations officer of the IRB Supreme Council. Now, while he is there, another key figure arrives, Bulmer Hobson. Now, Hobson had hitherto been the main secret bridge with the older revolutionaries on the East Coast and Midwest, and he'd into Pennsylvania. Hobson was superseded by Pearse right away. Didn't like it. That started an enmity, but then Hobson is exited the stage left by his own people come the rising for reasons that are complicated but understandable, and Pearse becomes the main guy. So when Pearse is executed, the two figures that are spoken about most of all and depicted most of all are Pearse and to a lesser extent Roger Casement. Because Roger Casement also went to America in the spring of 1914, and he was here to be with McGarity in Philadelphia when an international gun-running operation involving Germany and Belgium, the North Sea, 3 ships, a sailing vessel, and many other things was expected. They're expecting good news. Well, that's optimistic. I mean, this is an Irish conspiracy involving several countries, several boats, the North Sea, rendezvous off the Reitigan lighthouse, landings on one pier, and transshipment to a motorboat to a different vessel to be landed on the beach in Wicklow. This is complicated. It shouldn't work. There's too many moving pieces, but it did work. And he was in there when they got the telegram, guns landed safely. They didn't use those terms. Let's put it this way. Immediately, Casement was laden down with more gold, easier transferable, and more cash and more endorsements. Because the Irish Americans now realized we have an effective compatriot of our people in Ireland who are going to wage revolution. And they did. They did. And this is why you get the alignment we haven't seen in any potency since the 1867 period. There had been an echo of that in the 1880s, that's a different story, but now it's genuine, it's significant, and hundreds of thousands of dollars were raised. The Friends of Irish Freedom was created, another IRB front, which laid the sinews for later successor organizations that during the War for Independence raised about $8 million. Some say $9 million. And that is a staggering amount of money. And Butte, and Missoula, and Anaconda, these are the places the money's coming from. The Montana was represented at the Clan conventions. They were represented at the Hibernian conventions. They were involved in all the things that were going on across this country. And again, some of that's been greatly documented by my colleague and friend here. So the clock was ticking down, and then, of course, what happens is this. The damn Great War breaks out. Before Home Rule is in. Shell for the duration, now we've got nothing. Keeps the UVF quiet for a while, that's one thing. The British sort of are preoccupied. But the Devoy network are saying, now is the time for action. You got some of the money. The original plan would have been to acquire large quantities of weaponry here and ship it. Later on, substantial quantities of weapons were acquired here and shipped in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. But once war was declared, even though America hadn't entered the war at that point, and looked like it might not at all, it was difficult to procure enough breathing room on the docks to load, cross international shipping lanes, and unload without being interdicted. You didn't want to risk 200 grand's worth of rifles if they're going to be impounded by the British. Of course not. But the money was available. And one thing I could have said was this. When the Irish Americans heard that there was the super secret that 1,500 weapons were going to be brought in from Germany, they bankrolled it. And the loan that was acquired, realised by Alice Stockbridge Green Circle in London, was already backed by Devoy. And they all got paid back and took the money. Fair dues. A loan's a loan, I suppose. Thanks very much, Alice. But so even the Hoth and Kilcool gun-running operations were bankrolled out of America. Now, most Irish people don't know that, because our history has tended to romanticize and to simplify many of the things that are salient. And collectively, you're getting a different take that isn't correct. The role of America is underestimated and under-researched. Well, moving forward, the war caused ructions to the volunteers, because many military-age young men decided, I wouldn't mind being involved in this war before it's over at Christmas, that type of thing, and joined en masse. Many members of my own family did. There's very few Irish families didn't have someone in it. About 7 members of my extended family were killed in it, and that's probably more than most, but it wouldn't be a record. They fought. By 1915, they'd fought in the retreat from the Mons very effectively. The Munster Fusiliers were notably gallant. They'd fought the Donnell campaign in Suvla Bay. Some of them were actually on Anzac Beach with the Australians and New Zealanders. The New Zealand contingent that got the furthest of anyone was led by an Irish New Zealander, Fintan, the son of Lawler, Peter Lawler, the Eureka Stockade protest in Australia, their biggest ever mining protest, the Eureka Stockade in the 1850s, and his brother was Fintan Lawler, the great radical thinker who influenced James Connolly and Patrick Pearse. Now, Connolly represented a different strand. He lived for the best part of 5 years in Troy, in Newark, in Paterson, in Chicago, and he was well known as a member of the IWW and other far leftist organizations. There would have been a sensibility to Connolly that was important. The fact he had his own newspaper called The Harp meant that he had a bigger reach than just as a simple trade union organizer. He ran foul of different factions that went back to Ireland, where he became the key figure in the Irish Citizen Army, a small basic trade unionist militia, largely transport and general worker union guys who were very coherent on their politics and very well trained. So they come into the fray, they're brought into the fray, because people like Clark were afraid that Connolly would go it alone. So Connolly's associations with America were very strong, and they were ongoing in the 1910s. In 1915, the pace was quickening. The war was not going well for anybody, and does it ever? But suffice it to say that Joseph Mary Plunkett, a member of a very wealthy landed family, the family who owned Maynooth Seminary, by the way, and the Shelburne Hotel, it may be another landmark you might recognize, a man who did not need to be involved in these things, came as the military plenipotentiary of the IRB to New York, because Devoy was the man who could arrange guns from Germany. If you can't ship huge quantities of guns across the Atlantic from America, the Germans might be able to risk a consignment or two from the much closer North Atlantic and indeed the North Sea and Atlantic approaches. That's why they went to Germany, not to fight for Germany, with Germany, or on their behalf, but to get their weaponry. Now, Roger Casement believed that the IRB should have been allied to the Germans, but the IRB never did that. They never did that. The only people they're ever allied to is Clan na Gael. And that's why, whilst Germany is alluded to in the proclamation, the only country named is America, which was not providing hardware, was providing moral and financial support. So, as was said earlier tonight by the ambassador, you have a situation where 5 of the 7 people who signed the proclamation had close and recent connections with America. They did. They'd all lived here or been here. One of them, the lead signatory, was Tom Clark, who was an American citizen. The guy who picked the spots for the anticipated German shipments was Dermot Lynch, also an American, a man who later elicited solicitations for clemency from Teddy Roosevelt and from Woodrow Wilson. That's not a bad CV to have, I suppose. The money coming in was significant. It basically financed all the clandestine activities of the volunteers, and particularly the IRB, which meant you didn't have to rob banks, you didn't have to engage in criminality, meant you could focus on the pure political strain, and basically they did so. You could issue your propaganda, you could send your emissaries where they needed to go, and I won't lie to you, it's a tremendously complicated story. But there are signs that things were moving towards a head, and that was the death of O'Donovan Rossa in Staten Island in June 1915. O'Donovan Rossa would have been regarded as the most revered of the old dynamite-tards, and an older Fenian from a different generation who suffered grievously for his politics in British dungeons and wanted everyone to hear about it and did so very effectively. His third wife, Mary, was a very gifted propagandist, very skillful propagandist who toured America. I'm sure she was here, looking for Irish communities to enlist their aid and their moral support, their financial support for the Irish struggle. When he died in a state of some delirium, she readily agreed to use his passing as a propaganda stunt for the Fenians in Ireland. Now, they'd done this before, and his one capped them all. Consider this. A guy who's died in Staten Island, who hasn't really been in the news for a while, is not buried there or his native West Cork, as had been his original intention. The widow sees her way clear to agreeing with Devoy, who she knew very, very well, and people coming to and from Ireland. OK, we'll send them back. We'll use his body as a demonstration in Dublin. 100,000 people went to that, organised by the Fenians, addressed by Patrick Pearse, who gave a brilliant speech, filmed by not only British Pathé News, but also an Irish-American crew sent from New York for the purpose. Now, that film, unfortunately, is no longer extant. If you can find your archives, please let me know. But after the executions in 1916, that film toured America. And again, I'd be damn surprised if it wasn't shown somewhere around here at some point. Anyway, pause for replenishment. It's thirsty work talking about the Republic. Now, here's what he said. I only read the last bit of it. And bear in mind, he's not back long from America. He'd been to Rhode Island, he'd been to Philadelphia, he'd been to Delaware. He'd met all the heads, he'd met all the public and private leaders that mattered. Pearse was definitely their guy. And now they're sending people to film him. And it was obviously shown secretly before he was executed. We just don't know that. There's no written accounts of it, but it must have been shown behind closed doors. And the British Pathé version was shown international, and snippets of that are available on YouTube, so have a look sometime. Not right now, please, but maybe later on, right? Here's what Pearse said on the 1st of August 1915 in the Republican plot in Glasnevin. Rulers and defenders of realms had need to be wary if they would guard against such processes. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they've purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything. Think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And what Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. Yikes, Pearse. I'm always afraid of bursting into flames when I read that, because it's meant to be incendiary. This is during wartime. You had uniformed men of an organisation pledged to overthrow the British government rule in Ireland, marching with weapons in Dublin City under military command, with huge public acclaim. And the local force of law and order were watching and noting and doing what they have to do, but daring not interfere. The major organiser of that was Ned Daly, fated to be shot. Ned Daly was the brother-in-law of Tom Clark, and he was the son of the great arch-Fenian in Ireland, John Daly, right? Now, John Daly would have been the only Fenian of comparable stature living in Ireland to O'Donovan Rossa, brought back in a casket. And by the way, they found the casket. The casket is extant. It's a long time ago, but it's not a long time ago. You know what I'm saying? Well, moving on. This was a wartime declaration that something's going to happen soon, and that exercised minds. The British authorities in Ireland were naturally concerned by this, and they did the best they could to infiltrate, to observe, to analyse. But when you're dealing with suppressing a mass movement that has a revolutionary core, you have to tread softly, because they may be forced into premature action that could be disastrous. Now, the war was going very badly for everyone in 1915. The Allied powers had done poorly. They'd been repulsed from the Turkish campaign, which meant they couldn't alleviate Russia. Russia was teetering on the edge of a collapse that would happen in 1916, allowing a two-front war to be folded into one front war, with German advantage in fighting capacity, in experienced soldiers, in tactical doctrine, and perfectly good weaponry. They've always been good at that. So, again, as you may know, I'm sure you do all know, the war was nearly lost in the spring of 1918. So it's not a foregone conclusion that Britain were going to be okay. It didn't really look like that in 1915. The Fenians were getting a little bit worried. What if the war's over before we get a chance to strike? I mean, that was a problem. And the other problem was this. If America formally joined the war, it was going to be very difficult to access any form of Irish-American support, because it could have been perceived as unpatriotic or difficult. The same thing happened back in the Spanish-American War in 1898. That's one of the reasons why so few Irish-Americans crossed to the celebrations of the 98 rebellion in Ireland. They expected 250,000 people to come, and that didn't happen because it's unpatriotic to travel during wartime. The Spanish-American War was an issue. These are the type of precedents these people are thinking about. I mean, they thought it through. Their logic may not be correct, but it's not irrational. So when it came to 1916, they decided we're going to go for it. Now, by that point, the moderates had either gone home, and most of the people who followed Redmond did not go to the front. They went home. But certainly 30,000 or 40,000 people who had been volunteers joined the Imperial forces. Now, remember, we say for shorthand British Army, but they were regarded as Imperial forces. You weren't joining a foreign army. This is the army of the Empire, which always had a very high Irish quotient. The Army of India was often 60% Irish recruited. That was the biggest standing component in the Empire. So disproportionately Irish people were doing these things. Anyway, so it comes to 1916. On St. Patrick's Day 1916, which for some of you don't know about this, is the 17th of March. I don't know if you heard about this thing of ours. You know. The 4 Dublin City battalions mobilised in uniform, and many of them armed, openly, illegally, quasi-legally, I suppose. They mobilised around their individual headquarters, and they did route marches and then major parades, and they took over Dublin City for 2 or 3 hours. No one stopped them. They're outside all the places that mattered. Dublin Castle, you know, the GPO, outside the Commander-in-Chief's residence. He was very annoyed when an element led by Eamon de Valera, the 3rd Battalion, wouldn't let him pass through their march into his residence. But well, come on then, see what happens. There was a furtive but nonetheless noticeable militancy in the air and visible. And that was the dry run for the Rising, the St. Patrick's Day manoeuvres. A hell of a lot of war material was moved around the country under the cover of people coming to and from all parts of the country, because it wasn't just the Dublin battalions. Others were there as guests. The plan laid by the Military Committee, a secret subset of the IRB Supreme Council, headed effectively by Patrick Pearse, and comprising these 7 men who signed the proclamation, and more of them in a minute, they had by then formulated a very, very advanced form of coup d'etat, striking at command and communication targets in a skillful manner, to timetable, amidst massive acts of sabotage of the entire rail network, the entire road network, the rolling stock, and all the telephone exchange equipment, right? There was a very, very sophisticated plan for this, and people trained in it and equipped for it, supported by secondary risings in the countryside to tie down the garrison forces that were always heavily represented in rural Ireland. I live and work in Limerick, which had 5 active barracks in Limerick City. Right? Dublin was festooned with barracks. It was talk about the military-industrial complex. We had it before you guys did. It's just very low tech. And Eisenhower was right, and we had it first. Let's put it this way. The idea was not to defeat the British military or the imperial force in Ireland. You would never do that. But if you could alienate local areas for a short period of time, break through the barrier of wartime censorship so people would hear about it and realize the seriousness, you could declare your republic. You could claim that we're a small nation, that we demand self-determination, that we demand be represented amongst the countries of the earth, amongst the nations of the earth, as Robert Emmet literally said, and is quoted in that proclamation. Who could say that Ireland could not self-determine? What right would they have to say that we could not self-determine when we weren't allowed vote, when still no women had the vote, and the entire electorate was something like 70% of the population? You were not rebelling against lawful authority. You're striking a blow to bring in democracy. And this is where the text of the proclamation is important, and I'll read a small bit to you. Just to reassure you, this is not a real one. I haven't folded a real one written on it, I promise. It starts with something important. Declaration in Irish, Public na hÉireann, which is the first major document ever to address to the Irish people in Irish. And then it says the provisional government of the Irish Republic. 2 things there. Provisional government. We're not a junta. We're not elite taking over. We know we're only provisional. You'll vote in the people later. And that's later made explicit. Of the Irish Republic, that sedition is against the Treason of Felony Act to advocate an Irish Republic. In theory, you could be executed. In theory, you could have been transported in the old days. That's why they got Mitchell on. I suppose their loss was Tennessee's gain. Who knows? To the people of Ireland were meant to be subjects. They're meant to be subjects of the British Crown. of Westminster governance, or lack of governance. And I start hearing another thing that's historic. Irish men and Irish women. Get out of here. Equal standing for men and women? You must be mad. If you give them the vote, the world will collapse. Yeah. In the name of God and of the dead generations from which he receives our old tradition of nationhood. In other words, we just want it back. Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. I'll read you the bit that's important. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. That's an echo of the American Declaration of Independence. The long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished, except by the destruction of the Irish people. In other words, you had a good go at us. Cromwell had a go. Black Death didn't help. The White Wars were a bit of a problem. On Gorta Moor was a disaster. But we're still here, and just because we've been through bad times doesn't mean we will not be a nation again. The Irish Republic, a sovereign, independent state. The Irish Republic is entitled to and hereby claims the allegiance of every Irish man and Irish woman. The Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights, and equal opportunities to all its citizens, you meant your subject, and declares its resolve to pursue the happiness and prosperity of the whole nation and all of its parts, cherishing all the children of the nation equally. Now, that is saying universal adult suffrage, separated church and state, independent judiciary, and progressive governance on a democratic basis. Now, that's what they're fighting for. Now, they'd all been told this for years in individual addresses and columns and polemics and pamphlets, in speeches by Pearse and by Hobson and by others. They knew that's what this was about. But this is deliberately meant to be a Declaration of Independence. Now, again, you will be aware that the actual American Declaration of Independence is the printed version that was distributed, and not the fine parchment in the Smithsonian. That's not the Declaration. That's an artistic representation of the Declaration. The printed version is what it is, and that's why this is printed. It was never probably ever signed by those men. There's no evidence they ever literally signed it. This is not a copy of it. That's what you get. And this is what they read out, and this is what they posted up. They wanted to hold out for 2 days, having announced that document to the world by broadcast, which almost never happened, later by telegraphy. Both eventually did happen, by the way, but there's some difficulties with that technically. And they wanted the American government to recognize the Irish Republic. They hoped that the French government would recognize the Irish Republic, and almost certainly they wanted Berlin to recognize the Irish Republic. And I will never understand, if not for the hell of it, the devilment of it, that Berlin didn't recognize the Irish Republic. That would have been a political masterstroke. Now, on the 24th of April 1916, after many reverses, including the very clever British Royal Navy operation that cut off the odd arms ship on the 21st of April 1916, after a huge command dissension that we can't go on without the arms, we're going to go on, well, we'll think about it, we'll postpone it 1 day, from the Sunday to the Monday. They still mobilized, and ultimately more than 2,000 of them were in and around the mobilized zones, much smaller than expected, to be honest. And if it had 8,000 or 10,000, who knows, it would have been possibly not necessarily any better. It's hard to know. Sometimes less is more. They made their point with the men they had, all of whom were fully armed, thanks to years of quiet weapons acquisition out of this country, via Glasgow, into Derry, via the St. Lawrence, across the Atlantic, via direct shipping from places like Philadelphia, weapons acquired in Baltimore, of course, New York, all the places you'd expect. They were coming in cases and boxes and 10s and 20s. They were fully armed. The British knew that they were, which meant that they had hesitated. Now, just a quick counterfactual point of history, which I hate. There is a view that the IRB leadership, which was split on this issue, deceived themselves. In other words, they deceived Owen MacNeill, the nominal commander, and that's true. They also deceived many of the volunteers. They weren't deceived. They just weren't informed until the day of action when they did mobilize, those who did mobilize. In the meanwhile, they've been told not to by MacNeill. But this is the dissension I'm talking about. In Limerick, 7 conflicting sets of orders came down on Easter Sunday. Do mobilize in March, don't. Now, you weren't supposed to know this was it. So for all you knew, it was just mobilization. Very few people knew that the balloon has gone up and we were going to really go for it. So bear that in mind. Hindsight can confuse us on this. They still had enough to make a go of it. The reading of the proclamation did happen. It was witnessed by many people. A very strange historian has claimed that it didn't happen, but I mean, this takes all sorts, I suppose. It's an important document. They did better than they thought. Martial law was declared. The British cordon came in as expected. Reinforcements from places like Athlone. I met a man from Athlone, family from Athlone earlier. The artillery barracks was there, brought up 18-pounders. They brought in thousands of reinforcements from England and Wales, as you'd expect. They knew they'd never hold out. They were a bit surprised at the ferocity of the British counterattack. It's not true that Connie didn't think they'd use weapons. Just no one thought they'd use weapons of that destruction in a zone that had not been cleared of civilians. So obviously the civilian deaths was high, and there's no doubt at all. It's certain that the rebels shot people by mistake, and maybe shot people they shouldn't have shot. I mean, this is what happens in these circumstances. But the use of artillery, of snipers, of machine guns from the higher echelons of Trinity College Dublin, British snipers on the roof of the Mater Hospital. Can you imagine if the IRA had used the roof of a hospital, a maternity hospital, mind you, to shoot at anyone walking across the street? I think we'll be hearing more about it this year, but it was them, so we don't really worry. And I'm okay with that. I mean, you're not going to find any sort of romanticism in warfare. Anyone who's looking for that is barking up the wrong tree. This is what you're going to get in these circumstances, right? And it's brutal and difficult. Now, the American dimension is mentioned here by the reference to the exiled children in America. And exiled children in America means the Irish Americans and their backing groups. They explicitly mention the Irish Republican Brotherhood in this document. And that's a tipping to the wise anyway. This is us, by the way. We're not just volunteers, we're actually the IRB. And to a large extent, 1916 should be seen as an IRB episode. Now, moving along. The Republic was not recognised by anybody. And contrary to Pearse's expectations, the gesture that they'd made in arms was not sufficient to allow Ireland representation at the Paris peace talks. An Irish delegation and an Irish-American delegation went to Paris peace talks in 1919 to try and talk about, can we have our plebiscite, please? Or can we have our consideration? You're making Poland, Czechoslovakia, Silesia could be given to Germany or to Poland. All these things were in play, and they're important, significant issues. But we were not allowed to do that because our enemy was the British Empire, and international interests did not favour our independence. But to go back to the rising itself, after 6 days, they'd made the issue. They knew they weren't going to win by force of arms. Civilian deaths were mounting, particularly due to the use of machine guns and artillery, to the point that it wasn't going to work. It wasn't a particularly bloody rising. You're talking about fewer than 2,000 people being killed, right? So in terms of death toll, it's not the Spanish Civil War. You know what I mean? It's nothing horrendous. But politically, it was seismic. This was meant to be formerly the second city of the empire. We're in their back garden. We're heavily garrisoned. They're at war. Not quite an existential threat like the Second World War, but they're in a bitter war against a well-resourced, powerful, and capable enemy. The Turks could not be defeated. The Russians were not as formidable as they would later become. And the Austro-Hungarians were doing well enough to basically look like winning until 1918. So under those circumstances, the decision was taken to stand down. Then, of course, politically, the British made a miscalculation. They had suppressed the true nature in their reports of what had happened in Dublin, and more of that in a minute before I finish. They called it rioting in Ireland. The Irish Australians were told it was a pro-German riot, and that confused them because they would never have supported that. Even the moderate Irish Australians who were very big supporters of Home Rule, and for years campaigned that Ireland should have at least the same status as the white settled dominions of Canada and Australia, at least that. And Home Rule wouldn't even got that, would have been close to it, but not as good as that. They were confused. The French were misled and were very annoyed about it later on when they heard the truth. Augustus Birrell, the Chief Secretary in London, admitted, quote, there has been a censorship. And he pointed out the specific reason was that they didn't want to confuse the Irish Americans. Okay. Now, meanwhile, the Fenians had their own way of doing these things. And John Devoy, I think, was the first person in America to have the full, accurate body text of the proclamation, which he printed. This was front-page news in the New York Times. And initially what you see is the initial reports are all the bowdlerized, lying British ones, which minimise the extent of the rising, its seriousness, its violence, its scale. And then the later ones, once you bring in more Irish sources, and indeed from north, south, east and west, become more authoritative and more honest because they just couldn't keep a lid on it. And that's what the Irish had calculated on. This would be too big for them to pretend it hadn't happened. Now, I was in the Bute archives yesterday very briefly, had a quick look at a couple of the tomes. And it's now a measure of, I suppose, of acceptance in Ireland that the New York Times, which is typically an Anglophile newspaper, gave it a lot of coverage, and it did, consecutive days. So I said to myself, what am I going to say down here? Well, the Bute Daily Post, including the 24th of April, which 11th American time is the first day of the rising, has 5 consecutive days of front-page coverage. Then the 29th of April. Then there's a small gap. Then you got 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12 May front page. That's not counting secondary articles and supplementary articles. In some cases, 2 or 3 pages. And that's the Butte Daily Post. A typical one is this, on the 29th of April. Now, this is after they're starting to hear things that are closer to the truth without CNN to help them. Centre of Dublin in flames. Government uses artillery. Now, can you imagine being Irish American here and hearing the British government are using artillery in Dublin? What's going on? Rebels resist from many improvised fortresses. Now, that's not negative. That's not negative. It's not particularly positive, but it's not negative. So it says, okay, that's the Butte Daily Post. Good on you. What about the Butte Miner? Oh. The 26th of April, their headline, revolutionary outbreak occurs in Ireland. Dublin is the scene of serious uprising. Yes, that's it. 28th, spread of the revolt in Aran Island. 29 April, Irish rebels are behind their barricades. And it also did something that other papers weren't doing. They were using New York and East Coast sources to say what was happening in the Irish diaspora in this country. There was a meeting of the United Irish League, which is a body, international body that supports the Irish Parliamentary Party here, the moderates, the Redmondites, okay? A meeting had been gate-crashed by Republican supporters of the Klan who denounced Redmond. Now, this has been reported here. That's a serious story. Redmond's supposed to be the Great White Hope, and in New York he's been denounced by people. On the 4th of May, this is about Patrick Pearse. Pearse had many friends in the United States because they're getting reports from those who knew him. Now, moving towards a close. The genie was out of the bottle here. No one could deny this was a significant event. And when people read the democratic precepts of this, in Britain it could be dismissed as democratic, liberal talk. In America, it resonated because that's what America's meant to be about, and more than any other country is about. Suffice to say that this was important. In New York, just for a matter of flavour, there's a very important young Irish woman named Sidney Gifford, from an ill-fated, famous Catholic and Protestant family. You wouldn't believe this. Girls raised in one religion, boys in the other. 2 of them married guys who were shot by the British in the Breakers' Yard of Kilmainham Prison between the 3rd and 12th of May. But Sidney Gifford, in 1914, came to New York to act on behalf of Sinn Féin, then a very small party that was affiliated with all these people, but was by no means their official front. They weren't. That is not the case with Sinn Féin in those days. And the British made a mistake to call this the Sinn Féin Rising. They just couldn't pin it on it. They didn't want to call it the Fenian Rising. They didn't even want to call it Irish Volunteer Rising because you've got 300,000 of them, and tens of thousands of them are fighting on the Western Front. So Sidney Gifford founded a branch, 2 branches of Cumann na mBan, using for personnel initially members of the Ladies AOH. So in New York, you could be in the Ladies AOH and Cumann na mBan. That's actually quite interesting. Now, there's a very big armed Irish militant group in New York, and they had their own Irish volunteers in New York. They'd owned the Fianna Éireann, the youth wing, and every other aspect that you could think of was there, was replicated in those big East Coast cities. Now, she met Rudolf Kommer, because she happened to know, she made it her business to know, the Austrian consul in New York City, Rudolf Kommer, who's a Jewish man from Vienna. He saw that she was despondent on hearing of the executions. He said, events in Ireland were the talk of all the embassies in Washington, and that the general impression was that we had struck a blow to British prestige for which she would never recover. Now remember, prestige is important in diplomacy in wartime. Now, her actions were to go to Carnegie Hall, to the other big halls, and ultimately Madison Square Garden, was booked for several days, where pro-Irish Bazaar was called, basically pro-Irish rallies. But on this particular day, they went into a hall, I think it was Carnegie, and herself and her sister had made the Republican tricolour, which was relatively unfamiliar outside IRB circles as a symbol of the Irish Republic. Traditionally, it would be the green flag with the gold harp uncrowned. The modern provincial flag of Leinster is derived from that, and indeed the seal of the Irish state, the modern Irish state, is the left-facing uncrowned harp, the sovereign harp. Now, the tricolour was what the IRB always used from 1848. Sometimes more popularly than others, they also used harps and other symbols, but that's for another day. But when the flag was well received at the rally, they said, okay, let's take it on the Fifth Avenue bus. So they got on top of the Fifth Avenue tram. We introduced the flag to New York by flying at the top of a Fifth Avenue bus. I was quite starting to see that the cops already recognized us, as at every intersection of the streets, they stood to attention and salute. And that's the NYPD for you. They were nearly all from Kerry, you know what I mean? So to finish up, I've covered a lot of ground there. I know for many it must be confusing. I've only scratched the surface. There's many other names, places, organizations. There's no way I would inflict them on you on an occasion such as this. But I hope I've made the basic point that there was a significant and salient American dimension to the origination of the event in which the modern Irish state was proclaimed as a sovereign, democratic, progressive entity. And that cannot be a bad thing. So speaking of personal capacity as an Irish citizen, thank you for all your help.
My thanks to Ruan. We have time for a few questions, or as many as you have time for. There are microphones, as I understand it, in the aisles. Is that correct? Well, you can make yourself heard. Are there any questions with these lights in my eyes? Are there any hands up that I can see? Yes.
I appreciate your glancing mention of Cumann in the United States. I wonder if you could say more about the women in the labor movement in the United States and the women in the nationalist movement in the United States, as well as those in Ireland who helped participate in the Rising.
Well, up in Chicago, in the same graveyard that, well, that's not going to be easy, to be honest. I've been asked about the role of Irish women in the labour movement here. It's really not what I came here to talk about. But I can say this, people like Gertie Flynn, Mother Jones, many significant people in the labour movement were Irish-born or of Irish-American extraction. And they were always accepted because the Republican politics was meant to be inclusive and progressive and civic-minded. And the trade union movement was also meant to be that, and there's often overlappings in between them. Seeking fairness and employment is not that different for seeking a civic society of equality. And the Fenian Brotherhood, who are often sort of represented as sort of bearded old guys drinking in corners and smoking pipes, well, they were radical. Remember, such things as the fact that they were secular, that was a radical position in the 1910s. Right? Most countries were not secular. France and America are the exceptions. You'd have casual invocations to a higher power and a divinity in most formal documentation, but you'd often do in a country like Britain was, which had an established religion, and the head of state was the head of the religion, the Church of England, the Anglican faith. So whilst I can't say too much about it, I'll say this. Cumann na mBan are particularly interesting because they are a very distilled version of society. Generally speaking, and I hate to generalize, but you sort of have to sometimes, it would have been a bigger step for a young Irish woman to join something like Cumann na mBan than for a typical Irish guy, because there's relatively little public presence of women in society. Okay, so they were very highly present in the foundation of the Gaelic League organisation. They were involved in the Gaelic GAA as well, just to a lesser extent, but they were there. And of course, there are sports that were tailored towards women and girls, and all from the start, they were taken seriously by the Irish Republicans. Countess Markievicz was attached to the Irish Citizen Army. She was fourth in command, actually, of the Stephenson Garrison, but that's remarkable. There were no women anywhere in the British military forces who had command of men. And there were other women who had command of men. In Margaret Skinner, in particular, who came from Glasgow to take part in the Rising. Now, this was a sign that they took these things seriously, that they meant Irish men and Irish women. And without going on too long or being too diffuse about it, if you look at who actually formed Cumann na mBan in April 1914, they had secretly met in the same location on the 25th of November 1913, at the same time that the men formed under Fenian suzerainty the Irish Volunteers Óg na hÉireann in the Rotunda, which was only about a quarter of a mile down the road, right, in the Rotunda centre. They were down in Wynn's Hotel at the same time, plotting, conspiring, planning to form Cumann na mBan, which remained a quite small organisation. And they're going to be the sisters and the girlfriends of the men who were involved in the IRB, which meant that when the Redmondite split happened and the male moderates mostly joined Redmond at the front or retired, hardly any members of Cumann na mBan did, because they were much closer to the IRB centre. And that's why they're entrusting somebody like Sidney Gifford, a young woman in a difficult marriage, to go to New York and to head up their political interests, which she did very well indeed, and to facilitate emissarial traffic of people like Joseph Mary Plunkett. who had come from Germany secretly to New York to help arrange the German weapons with devoid contacts in the German embassy and the consulates. So let's just put it this way. It's another big story. It's another book or a thesis or maybe a series of theses, and I hope someone does it.
The Irishmen who were part of the British Army in the Second World War, conscripts or volunteers?
Okay. Well, the Second World War, of course, is different. Yeah. Well, I've been asked were the Irishmen conscripted. The short answer is no, but for a very particular reason. The Military Service Bill had come forward in 1916, and the British were in the process of conscripting their men. They couldn't get anyone else who wanted to go to the front in 1916 for good reasons. You're coming back feet first, right? Or not at all in the case of being shelled to death in Flanders or Passchendaele. So that was contemplated originally for Ireland, but the Rising made it absolutely politically impossible to consider including Ireland in conscription, which happened from 1916 in England. Moreover, when they got desperate in the spring of 1918 because they were losing the war badly, and the Germans were once again within nearly shelling range of Paris, and that would have been it, in that sector anyway, they toyed with the idea of extending conscription to Ireland at that point. Things had cooled down a bit. But such was the reaction that you have the formulation of an alliance for the first time since 1795 of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church with the revolutionary cutting edge of the IRA, who had considerably organised and grown in 1917 and 1918. So with that sort of alliance, they backed off. So no, they weren't conscripted, they're all volunteers. It's a tragic war, and no one came out of it very well. But no, they were not conscripted. Some of them expressed sympathy with the Irish rebels. Many of them later on came back and said, why didn't you tell us you were doing this? We would have done something. Some Irish-British soldiers, when I call it that, were captured by the rebel forces in Dublin City, in the take of the GPO and other sectors, and they wanted to fight with the rebels. And the rebels said, no, thanks, but no thanks. This could go wrong, and if it does, you will definitely be shot. Right? And it's not necessary. So some members of the Connacht Rangers and other famous Irish units who were home on leave or on duty helped out in auxiliary roles. Some did cross the line, by the way, but not in any great numbers. There was a so-called mutiny of Irish soldiers, which led to several of them being executed in the Connacht Rangers to discourage others, but that's another story. They were terribly compromised. Some of those later on, like Tom Barry, who saw service in Egypt and Mesopotamia, returned to Ireland on being demobilised, was a member of the British Legion, by the way. In other words, the Ex-Servicemen's Association, a fraternal group, and later became one of the most effective IRA field commanders ever.
In terms of what is now Northern Ireland, in your opinion, how much of the geographic area would have opted to go with the Republic instead of the British, had it not been for British gerrymandering?
Well, the thing is, in 1916 and 1918, there's only one Ireland. There is still only one Ireland. There's two states in Ireland. Partition had not occurred. There had been some discussion of temporary exclusion of some Irish counties temporarily to try and get the political tenor to the point that macro issues could have been dealt with. That didn't occur. The point is this. It's like asking the United States, it's like asking the southern states after being defeated, do you want to go back and be independent? Or do you want to leave the union by vote, right? That's not how things are done. You have a political entity that is what it is, particularly the case of Ireland, which historically had always been united, always dealt with as a single entity by the British. And while there was localised strength of those who were pro-British and anti-Home Rule in the northeast of Ireland, and they had powerful backers in Dublin and powerful backers in the UK and elsewhere, they represented at most 20% of the Irish population. Now, the idea of having a vote is the people with the greater numbers are the people who prevail, and they were not playing by democratic rules. So there's no, in my view, there's no legitimacy to that we should have had a plebiscite. If it can happen in Silesia, it should have happened in Ireland. But remember this, the Americans, the government of this country, refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles because they felt that its terms were too draconian towards Germany. And there's a lot of things going in the mix politically and internationally that had some sort of effect on the Irish situation. But playing by the rules of Trianon, of Sèvres, of Versailles, we should have been allowed to vote. And we did have a vote. The vote was the December 1918 election, where the first time some women and nearly all men could vote. All men could vote, and most women could vote. That's the first remotely democratic election in British Irish history. Sinn Féin won a landslide victory on the basis of the political programme outlined in the 1916 proclamation. Now, what they wanted to do was go directly to independence, Westminster said, no, you can't do that. They were never going to sit in a British Parliament anyway, so they sat in Dublin as the first Dáil. But that was a legitimate result administered under UK rules, and they didn't like the answer. That's it, isn't it?
Thank you, thank you. That was very good.